Hi everyone. So today I'm going to talk about ReVault and how you can get compromised by your secure system on chip. So hi, I'm Philippe Laulheret. I'm a senior vulnerability researcher at Cisco Talos. And so Talos is the threat intelligence branch of Cisco. And my team, what we do is we find vulnerabilities in third-party software. We report our findings to the vendors affected by the stuff we found, and eventually we publish our results. So that's what I'm doing today. And my focus on like Windows, embedded system, and so on. So what can you expect from this presentation? It's a 40-minute talk where I'm going to go over some of the bugs that I found in something called Control Vault that's made by Dell and Broadcom. And we reported a bunch of bugs like at the beginning of the year, which led to the full compromise of that thing called Control Vault. So maybe you've never seen that before. It's a laptop. Here you have like a fingerprint reader. Here you have an NFC card reader. And on the side you have like a smart card reader. And all of those devices gets connected onto that Control Vault device. If you look into the device manager, you will find that same Control Vault device, mysteriously like sitting there. And if you open the laptop and remove the battery, the device is here, the Control Vault board. Connects here to the motherboard, and here it's connected to smart card reader, and all you can see is just like a little like flash module. And in real life, it's like really tiny, really cute. So yeah. Okay, so now you could be like, okay, what is Control Vault? So technically it's Control Vault 3, and you can find it in 100 different models of Dell laptops, mostly latitude and precision models. And it's a mix of software, firmware, hardware. You have like Windows APIs or Linux APIs. You have a firmware running on a RTOS, you have an RTOS running on this chip here, which is a Broadcom BCM 58202. It's also meant to be a secure storage of secrets. So like here you have a flash that's encrypted. And technically the board itself is called Unify Secure Hub, which is meant to connect all those like security peripherals I mentioned previously. So you have Control Vault 3. The newer one is Control Vault 3 Plus, which you find in Dell Pro machines, also affected by the findings. And before that, you had Control Vault 2 and Control Vault 1. The first Control Vault was around 2010. Control Vault 3 was 2019. From quick reversing, it looks like some of the vulnerability we reported were also already present in the first Control Vault. So some of these bugs have been there for like 15 years. And just considering Control Vault 3 and 3 Plus, that's in the 10 of millions of devices likely affected. And there is no documentation, so we have some work to do. Step 1, we can Google stuff, and this one is a repository with the Linux API. And what's special about that is that it was compiled with debug symbols. So the host APIs for Control Vault on Linux have symbols. And so if you import that in IDA, Ghidra, or one of those, you get a lot of data structure, return values, enums, and so on, which is really helpful for reversing. And then you have that document, doesn't get much information in it, but it's a certification for the system on chip for its cryptographic module. Gives us some ideas of the internals of the module, and also the definition of some acronyms. For instance, here, like SBI stands for Secure Boot Image, for instance. So why would I target that? Beyond the fact that tens of millions of devices could be affected. The beginning of that project was much more humble. I was looking at processes running on my machine, and that part attracted my attention. So a few services are running without ASLR, so without address space layout randomization, which is a common mitigation to make exploitation harder. And in 2025, everything should have it, so that was surprising. And same, like some of the DLL didn't have it either. So I got really excited, and I started yelling from my window that I really want to hack the planet, So what do we do next? We dig a little deeper, and I was looking at the installer of Control Vault, and there's so many files. You have multiple drivers, like USB and all the peripherals. You have multiple Windows services, and also some mysterious DLLs that nobody imports. And also there's a firmware folder full of stuff, including those SBI thing I mentioned before, the secure boot image. Those are in clear text, so if you want to import it in IDA or Git you can. And then there is that another one called like Citadel, which is actually the application firmware. And that one, unfortunately, is encrypted. So more work to do here as well. But before we go too far, like some kind of system architecture. So here you have like the firmware with the boot ROM that's going to start the SBI, the secure boot image, and then start the application firmware. On the left side, you have like all of those peripherals that talk over some buses like SPI and whatnot. And on the right side, you have the host, so in our case, Windows, and they talk over USB. So you have a USB driver here, and then you have, whoop, the mouse stopped responding, that's great. You have some APIs, like user-level APIs and services and other stuff that allows that. So the way it works, if you want to communicate with the firmware, on the Windows side, the USB driver creates a device, and userland can open that device and send IO control command to it, and eventually the driver will send USB packets. But that's kind of tedious, so you have a higher level DLL that does that for you and implements a bunch of high-level functions. None of that is documented, obviously, but so you have like CV open, CV close, create object, get object, delete object, plenty of those. I think there's like 150 of them, and those are referred as like CV commands. Most of them expect a session to function, and that you get that with calling CV open. And dependent of that is on the firmware side, you have like a command handler, so called like CV manager or CV manager SBI, that will dispatch those commands to the implementation's firmware side. And all of that is like such a huge attack surface, so clearly like we want to look at it. But before that, we can do something kind of cute. We can, using like Python and C types, we can load the DLL that implements all of those functions. Using the Linux symbols that we obtained, we can also define exactly what kind of parameters they expect. And then we can just call some function, in that case, the get version function. And if you run that, you get that, which is like a version string coming from the board. So in like 20 lines of Python, you can interface with these devices that you didn't know about until now. So that's pretty cool. Okay, now that we know how to talk with the device, we want to like thread model a little. So same diagram as before, but with a different angle, which is looking at attack surfaces, and there's like kind of 4 of them. The main one is the firmware stack. So the SBI, the application firmware, they all implement a USB stack. So obviously like parsing USB can be tricky. They also do like CV commands, so logic bugs and similar. And then there's like all other like service interactions, because there is more than just CV commands. That can also be interesting. Then the whole firmware lives inside like a kind of a secure boot to make it harder to tamper with the firmware. And for that, you're going to have like some firmware updates, signature checks, which also we want to investigate. And then you have the Windows side. Originally I was looking for vulnerable driver, so that's something interesting to look at. And then you have like the services and the drivers would be interesting to look at as well. And finally, I'm not going to go over that today, but I wanted to mention it. The whole of that is like the hardware stack. And it's kind of interesting to think, those talks with the firmware. So what if a malicious fingerprint reader, for instance, were to try to compromise the firmware, or if a malicious firmware was trying to compromise the fingerprint reader? All of that, like if we really answer those questions, it's called like to 10x the scope of the project. So not for today, but interesting questions to think about. And just to double down on the secure boot part, it's kind of an incomplete diagram for now, but you have the boot ROM that verifies the SBI. The SBI is going to retrieve something called a secure code description that contains some key material. And with all of that, it's going to be able to start the application firmware. And during firmware update, all of that gets verified, and that's what we want to look at eventually. Okay, now we want to hack stuff. So let's see what the mitigation that's going to get in our way. have we seen before, like the Broadcom services don't have any SLR, so it makes it easy for us. But there is DEP, so data execution prevention. So you cannot just jump on the stack and it's not the 90s anymore. And for stack cookies, that are like a mitigation to make it harder to exploit Stack Overflow. Sometimes they're present, sometimes they're not. So it kind of depends. I'm not sure why, but that's nice. And on the firmware side, one really cool feature is that the flash is encrypted, and it can do execution in place while being encrypted, which I think is really cool. And then we have like secure boot. We'll see how secure it is. But then there is no SLR, no stack cookie. So for exploitation, it's pretty easy. DEP is questionable. Like if you try to jump onto the stack, the board is going to crash. But there is some read-write execute regions, so basically you can put a payload there, and if you have a Stack Overflow or similar, you can just execute that, and it's game over. Okay, so now that we have understanding of the system we have, we can start looking at stuff for real. As I said, the SBI is in clear, but the application firmware is encrypted. So we want to kind of find how to decrypt the application firmware by looking at the boot image. So looking for firmware decryption routines, we can look for strings, and we find those mention of decryption failure. So like those like pretty sad messages for the system are like good for us because actually it shows that it is decrypting the firmware. In practice, the decryption process is like a three-step process, and that can be found by reversing the upgrade service on Windows, for instance. So first step is the host is going to send upgrade start command, and with that is going to send encrypted header file from the firmware. That gets decrypted, verified, and to do that, the SBI is going to use default hard-coded keys if it doesn't have any other key material to use. Which is good for us because we don't have any key material at this point. And then new keys are going to get generated to store the firmware like encrypted in Flash. And then you call update with like chunks of data, and that's basically like sending like the remaining firmware that gets decrypted and written to Flash. It's using a custom IV computation. I don't have time to show that today, but I published a blog that you can find with like more details about that if you try to implement that at home. And finally, the upgrade complete command that verifies the whole signature, commit what remains to Flash, and done. So by re-implementing that algorithm, we can actually decrypt the main firmware, and that leads to having something to look at. So okay, now that we've decrypted the firmware, we can look for vulns. And the first thing I said before was the first thing you need to do with CV commands is called CV open. So let's look at what it does firmware side. First step, it allocates memory in firmware. Writes a session tag, SESS. And then it just returns that as a handle. So the pointer to that session is what is being returned to userland, which already we have like an address leak from the heap back to userland, which not the end of the world in itself, but already pretty suspicious. And then because when you open something, you should close it as well. CV close that will first validate the session. And for that, it verified that the pointer you provide, like the handle, which is a pointer, is within the proper heap range. Verified that the session tag is present, and pretty much that's all. There's a few extra checks that are irrelevant, but that's the idea. Then it will erase the tag and free the memory. And so now I know a lot of people in this room like to play CTF. You might be thinking, well, that sounds a lot like a potential arbitrary free, The whole check you have is whether or not the session is a session string present at the address you provide. So if you can put that in memory, you could free arbitrary section of memory. But can we do that? Yes, we can. We have a CV create object function that takes some data, and we place it on the heap. So straight out, we have arbitrary data on the heap. That being said, we don't control all the metadata of those objects. And also, we don't know the address of the object. the handle we get from that function is just a random number and not the address like that was for the session. So we need to locate the object we've just placed in memory. But for that, we can do something kind of cute. You have this cv-get-random function whose purpose is just to return random data from the crypto module. But it will validate the session first, and depending on whether or not the session is valid, will return a different status code. So with that, we also have a session oracle, where we can just send any address to the cv-get-random, and if it's a valid-looking session, it will tell us, and if it's not, it will tell us as well. So with that, with create object, we can place data on the heap. Get object and set objects, which I didn't show on the slides, let you read and write data. Get random lets you locate those objects, and close lets you free the session. So with that, we do have an arbitrary free on the heap. So now you could be like, oh, is it time for like heap exploitation? And that's me when I have to do that. I didn't really want to do it. So I was like, okay, let's step one step back, let's find more bugs, and maybe we can put a pin on that one. So there's more bugs. This function called like secure identify is also reachable with one of those like CV commands. And the main thing here, it takes like a handle to an object, and it will retrieve the property of that object, memcopy one of those property into this data2 here, this data2 buffer, and data2 is really just like a stack object. So here I was like, ooh, do we have a Stack Overflow like immediately? It's not that quite easy because we need to control the content and be able to put too much data in it. And it turns out we cannot quite do that during object creation, unfortunately. But we can tamper with the heap and its metadata. So we can do something pretty nice and tamper with like a legitimate object. So to do that, here's a cute diagram. The idea here is like representation of an object that we've created, where we already placed the session tag in it. Purple is data we can control. Blue is data we cannot control. It's not like a one-to-one representation, but it's just for illustration purposes. So what we can do is allocate that object, then free it using the cv-close command. And then we poke a hole inside the heap so we can allocate a smaller object that will be placed there by the heap manager. And then you can see that the purple here overlaps with the blue here, which means that using CV set object, we can tamper with the metadata of the smaller object by modifying the large object. And from there, we can feed the small object that we've been tampering with to secure identify and trigger the Stack Overflow with our malicious data. And with that, because there is no ASLR, no stack cookie, and we can place any payloads we want in memory, we can execute code. So that's cool, but what can we do? What do we want to do? And I think there is like two angles here that I want to talk about. One is we can execute our exploit and then make it return data to us. So the idea is we run whatever exploit, make it write any output into the large object we control, retrieve its data back to userland using cv-get object, and this way we have a two-way communication with our exploit. And with that we can dump the RAM, there might be secrets in it, we can dump the boot ROM, which would be like a fun target as well. But there's another one, which is a function called SOTP read key, that is used to retrieve key that is stored in the fuse of the chip, which is, sounds pretty fun to do. And the other thing we could do, but we're not going to do that today, is patch function pointers that would be, in memory, in place that are writable. And with that, we could basically hook or backdoor certain functions, which is kind of like a baby step towards, firmware modification. And we're not going to do that today, just because we will have something a little more interesting to do instead. But we'll see soon. So first demo, we're going to run the exploit and dump some keys. So the idea is, first we locate existing session using our session oracle. That's because the board was being in use, so they're like existing sessions. Now we forge a session and we free it. We exploit secure identify, call SOTP read key, write it to the object, retrieve the data. And here we've dumped two keys, an HMAC key and an AS keys. Those are like for my device and my device only, so that's why I don't have to blur it. And now you should be like, okay, keys, but what kind of keys? There's like a few different type of key materials. There's like something like 7 like fuse key, including 2 like AES and HMAC that are actually used to secure the flash and do this like secure storage. And also to encrypt the SCD, the secure code descriptor that I mentioned, in the a few slides ago. The SCD itself is going to contain like an RSA key that's used for firmware updates signature verification, and also the AES and HMAC key that are used for execution in place. And those ones are like regenerated every time. And finally, we have hard-coded default keys that we've seen before, and those are actually being used when the SCD is missing. And you could be like, okay, well, how do you lose that SCD? What happened to it, And it turns out there's this file called like clearscd.bin that is actually used for legitimate purpose during firmware update. So the host is going to reflash that using a cv flash update command and overwrite the legitimate SCD with 012F a bunch of times. And then it reboots in SBI mode, and the SBI sees that and is like, oh, I don't know what that is, and just stops and waits for an actual like firmware update. So that's interesting, but the striking part is we literally have an arbitrary flash write with that, and any user can call that function. So that's another like interesting design decision. And just to be fair, normally everything is encrypted in the flash. So, being able to write data doesn't help us because, we need to know the encryption keys. But we've just leaked them, so that begs the question, how secure this whole secure boot process really is, And so let's back to the secure boot diagram, a little like more completed this time. The boot ROM verifies the SBI, and the SBI retrieves the OTP keys, and using those OTP keys, it's going to decrypt the secure code descriptor that retrieves those keys, and those keys are used to populate the execution in place mechanism, and then install the application firmware. But there is no check of the application firmware at boot time. So the whole security of the application firmware relies on those keys and those stuff here like being secure. But we've just seen, that we can leak those keys and, decrypt that. So, can we do firmware modification now? So in theory, we could dump the device keys, retrieve the SCD content and decrypt it. And then that's the part that gets a little more tricky. We'd have to forge, an encrypted flash blob and HMAC it properly and try to reflash that, using the cv flash update command while the code is executing. I think that's a good recipe to just break your device. So instead, what we can do is forge our own SCD with our own RSA key. We put like the public key of a public-private key pair that we control. And then we can just forge a firmware update with that RSA key that we've created and just deploy that. And did it work? No. I messed up. I flashed the wrong SCD because it keeps swapping in DNS, so I'm at the wrong order, and that straight up bricked the device. Here, that's like a flash programmer that I had, and I had made a dump of the flash beforehand in order to recover in case I messed up. And so here, like, preparedness was good. But I restored the thing, fixed the SCD, and then once again, via flash update command, I reflashed it with the proper SCD, and this time that worked. That's the USB description of the device, and you can see here it says like pond because like I'm 12, but it means the application firmware was actually modified, and this is a persistent modification, so that even if you install Windows, that modification would stay there. And so that is a potential like implant in your machine. So pretty nice. But yeah, as a reminder, the USH, like the Unified Secure Hub, is centralize all of the security peripheral, but now it's kind of unsecure. So what can we do? One fun function is called CV fingerprint identify, and it's used by Windows Hello when you try to log in with your fingerprint. It will send a template to the board and ask, is any of those templates fingerprints like pictures, basically, does any one of those matches the fingerprint touching the fingerprint reader? And the firmware decides yes or no, it matches. So what happens if we turn that function and make it says always yes? Yes, it matches. So here's a quick demo. It's a plastic finger that I got at DEF CON last year, and I taped a piece of green onion to it, and the firmware has been tempered to always say yes to any fingerprint. And in practice, you can see the green onion. When I touch it, it unlocks the computer, and you see like the pond command. Thank you. So that's cool, but can we do more? Can we mess with Windows? And for that, I'm going to give you a little TLDR on the communication between the host and the firmware. No, between the firmware and the host. So when you send a CV command, the host is going to prepare arguments. And there's some weird TLV formats where the data is encapsulated. For instance, that type of encapsulation means upon decapsulation, it will just copy a buffer somewhere. But this one it's going to split the data into an integer, which is the size field, and then the buffer, and it's going to turn that into two separate parameters. Might be useful later. And what the host does is it's going to prepare arguments for both directions somehow. So it's going to allocate the destination buffers, the size, and send that to the firmware. So the idea is everything gets serialized. You execute your CV command, and upon return, you deserialize the data and copy the parameters back to the user. So for instance, for CV get random, here you have the toolist being prepared. Here you send the command, and here you copy the data back to the user. Pretty straightforward. But turns out, not so great, because on the firmware side, the firmware just decide to redefine the outgoing output, the data that's being sent back to the host, redefine the encapsulation type, and redefine the size. So, as long as everything is aligned, everything is good. But if you have a malicious firmware, not so great. Because the host trusts the new serialization, and so if you change, the encapsulation types or the size fields, you get overflows and type confusions. So with that, we can actually backdoor CV get random. And so the idea here is as I was showing before, on the host side, when you deserialize the data, you have two parameters. One is the integer on the stack, which is the size of the data that was returned by CV get random. And then you have the buffer that's going to be filled with the data. But what we can do is backdoor CV get random by making it return something malicious if you ask for a specific size, and swap the encapsulation type so that this plen integer is going to be treated as the buffer meant to receive the data. And with that, we can actually overflow that, and because it's a stack variable, we can trigger a stack overflow. And just for a quick demo here, on that side, so the video is a little crappy, but it's a toy binary I made that just basically called CV get random. And on that side, the idea is if you pass no argument to the command line, it's just going to call CV get random normally. But if you pass any argument on the command line, it will use that special size we use as a backdoor, and the firmware will return a malicious encapsulation data that will trigger a stack overflow. So the way it looks, I show quickly that nothing crazy is going on, and the vulnerable function is just calling CV get random. And I run the function a few times normally, just to show it does indeed return random data. That's cool. And this time I run it with a command line argument to tell the firmware to send malicious data, and that pops a calc. So it's pretty cool, but at this point you're well, it's just a toy binary, who cares about that? But can we do something a little better? Yes. Let's go after a system service instead. So what we need here is we want something with high privilege that run one of those control vault DLL that doesn't have ASLR, and hopefully in a stack layout that doesn't have those stack cookies that would get in the way. So for some targets, we have the Broadcom services. some third-party application, but unfortunately I couldn't find any that's currently being used with that stuff. Or there is also Windows Hello, like the fingerprint handling stuff that we were seeing in the previous demo. So I spent hours looking at all of the stack of all the functions and seeing what was exported. That's me being really sad. And after a lot of struggle, I found that thing. So the Broadcom storage adapter is one of the adapters that does the glue code between Windows Hello and the Windows biometric framework and the fingerprint reader that's coming from Control Vault. And we can see here that function take a handle to an object, called pretty much CV get object to fill up that header. And this header, somehow it's not within the stack frame of that function, but it's in the parent stack frame. And you can see there is no stack cookie between that thing and the return address here. So by using the same method that I described for CV get random, we can mess with it. So the idea here, Broadcom storage adapter is imported by Windows Bioservice to implement the fingerprint handling. And we can interface with that stuff with a kind of IO control-like interface that also any user can call. And that's kind of the stack, the call stack of that. So the exist CV object was the function on the screenshot. And it will call CV get object that is a kind of function we can overflow. And all of that is within that adapter. But basically, the idea is we can overflow the object header and corrupt the stack frame of that function and trigger basically take over the return address of the whole thing. And for that, we're going to use the same mechanism as previously described, where we backdoor CV get object, and if you request a special object that's going to be 1337, lead, instead of returning that object, it's going to return a payload that is going to compromise the whole thing. So in practice, that looks like that. At that point, I've already deployed a malicious firmware that has that will pop a reverse shell, and on that side, that you have the Windows biometric service that's going to do some interesting stuff. And basically, the POC here is just we going to interface with the backdoor we've already placed to call a CV get object with the malicious object handle, and immediately it call ncat. It starts a reverse shell, and we can connect to that, and you can see here it's starting the command, and we have a system shell. Thank you. So far, what we've done, we've got code execution on the application firmware. We have permanent modification of the firmware. We can bypass Windows login screen, if you do fingerprint login, and we've got system privilege. Can we do more? What else is to be done? So the fun stuff is that board, is connected over USB. So it's an internal USB. But it turns out that that's a ribbon cable that connects to your motherboard, and you can just get a little breakout board, and connect the wires as you should to a USB connector here. All the other wires are just 3 volts, 5 volts to power the board. And with that, we can, plug it over USB. So you can see when I connect it, there will be a new device that pops up. So this one here. Whoa. And we can interface with that board externally. And that returns the version string. So, and if you're paying attention, there's one device already present that was disabled. It's because that was running from that machine, which already have a control vault in it. But that was disabled, and for the demo, that's the one we plugged over USB. So the point of that is that it's actually unlocking a physical attack. Someone that would have access to your laptop could, remove the back, remove the battery, unplug the ribbon cable from your motherboard, and just directly connect to it to their own machine, and do all of the attacks I've described previously. So now it's also physical attack is in the threat model we're looking at. So yeah, to summarize all of that, there's roughly kind of 2 attack scenarios. One is a user might be compromised and by a threat actor, that would modify the firmware, and from there they could compromise Windows. Or a physical attacker could modify the firmware and then bypass the fingerprint or compromise Windows. And yeah, so findings, reports, and so on. We reported that to Dell earlier in the year. They released a patch in March and an advisory in June. We released all of those reports we sent to Dell, they're now on the Talos website, so you can read the technical details if you want. A bunch of CVEs and a few more to come in the next few months. And 2 write-ups, a high-level overview and a 5,000 words technical deep dive that goes over all I talked about today and a little more. So yeah, that's almost the end. I would just say I think firmware security is not a new topic, but it's so important. It's not AI, but still. And I think it's crazy that these kind of devices goes undocumented for 15 years and with such a big attack surface. And so I think us as hackers, maybe it's our role to poke at the system, try to understand how they work, and expose the risks that they face and that they bring to our systems. Or maybe if you like policies, you can also push for more transparency from the vendors that deploy these kind of things. So that's all I have for you today. You can find me on Twitter or Blue Sky. I will be around during the conference, and thank you. So now we have 4 minutes for questions. Thank you.
哇，感谢讲师精彩的演讲。那现场有人有问题想要询问讲师吗？有吗？可以直接在你前面的麦克风点开就可以直接问了。好，没有人要问，那我要问喽。
So, hi. Thank you very much for the presentation, and the demonstration is so amazing. It's crazy for me. So I would like to know that how long you take it from, for this project, from discover the stuff and then do the demonstration and everything. Because I found that you use the physical components, right? I believe you took a month of time to develop it and then do the testing and every stuff. And the second question would be why you choose this component? Because there's so much physical component in a machine, right? Why you will pick up this one for this project?
Okay, so for the timeline, I think I had started looking at the driver maybe around a year ago. But really, I started, I think I did most of the work in a few months early last year, for September to December, and then it was more reports, more research, so it kind of stretched for 6 months, and then I had maybe a month or 2 of writing blogs, presentation, and so on. So yeah, 9 months maybe for the work, but finding the early events took I don't know, a few weeks. It was more digging and finding more stuff. And as of why I picked that, literally there was just curiosity. I spotted this missing ASLR stuff, and I was okay, well, what is it? What it does? And what is that device? There's no documentation, and so I just followed the thread up to as far as it could take me, and it took me really far. But originally, I was just looking for an easy driver to mess with, just to have some work to do, But really, it was the curiosity of that mystery to be solved. Thank you.
好，那现场还有人有其他问题吗？那我想问 ，when the flash modification failed, does the
what?
device become break?
The device become
the laptop become breaks when you flash the
when it
firmware failed.
Yeah, I mean, the laptop was fine, but that one just stopped responding, and you could do nothing.
Okay.
My suspect what happened is it would try to boot, and it was fault, and it didn't go into a recovery mode or anything.
Okay.
But if you connect to the chip here and erase it, it will revert to a bootloader mode, and then you can update it again. So yeah.
Okay, got it. 好，那如果现场没有其他问题，那就再让我们掌声感谢一次讲者。
Thank you.
Thank you.